Paris glimmered in the soft glow of twilight, the Seine reflecting golden streaks from the Eiffel Tower. Karim Al-Farid, heir to the sprawling Al-Farid conglomerate, leaned back in his chair in the gilded auditorium of the Palais Garnier. Despite the splendor around him, the ornate ceiling, the murmur of high society exchanging pleasantries, his thoughts drifted. The charity gala he was attending, though undoubtedly noble, felt like another rote obligation, a mere checkbox on his endless list of familial duties. The lights dimmed, and silence cascaded through the audience. Moments later, the curtains lifted to reveal the ethereal figure of a ballerina standing alone on the grand stage. Her name, he would soon learn, was Layla Mounet. She moved like water, every gesture deliberate yet impossibly fluid. Her lithe body bent and extended as though she commanded gravity itself. Karim, accustomed to the mechanical elegance of boardrooms and diplomatic events, was struck silent. The ballet, an ode to fleeting time, unfolded with a melancholic beauty that left him disarmed. Each leap, each pirouette felt intimate, as though she danced not for the crowd, but for some invisible audience that lived in her heart. The final note faded, and applause erupted. Yet Karim found himself frozen, an inexplicable weight pressing against his chest. As Layla bowed, her poised expression barely concealing exhaustion, he realized he needed to know more about her. After the performance, Karim slipped away from the endless champagne toasts and mingling of Parisian elites. With the help of an assistant, he found himself backstage. The environment was starkly different. Industrial lights buzzed overhead, and dancers hurried about with towels and water bottles. There she was, seated near a mirror, removing her pointe shoes with deliberate care. Up close, she seemed smaller, her fragility stark against the confidence she radiated on stage. "Miss Mounet," he said, his voice more tentative than he'd intended. She looked up, startled, her wide, dark eyes meeting his. "Yes," she replied, guarded but polite. "I wanted to thank you for your performance," he began, unsure how to put into words the spell she'd cast over him. "It was extraordinary." A small smile flickered across her lips. "Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it." For a moment, silence hung between them. Karim noticed a faint tremor in her hands as she gathered her belongings. "Forgive my intrusion," he ventured. "Are you all right? You seem tired." She paused, her smile dimming. "Dancing is demanding," she said simply, "but it's my life." Before he could probe further, a fellow dancer called her name, motioning toward the exit. She gave Karim a polite nod. "Thank you again for your kind words, Mr. Al-Farid." Karim Al-Farid. Her brow lifted slightly, as though she recognized his name but chose not to acknowledge it. "Have a good evening, Mr. Al-Farid." She turned and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Karim standing amid the backstage chaos, his mind racing. There was something about her, something beyond her talent, a strength veiled in vulnerability. As he stepped out into the cool Parisian night, Karim resolved to learn more about the mysterious ballerina who had stirred something within him, a longing he hadn't known he possessed. The city hummed with life as Karim strolled along the Seine, his mind still consumed by the brief exchange backstage. The world of ballet was foreign to him, an art he had appreciated from a distance but never understood. Layla Mounet had changed that. Her movements on stage had seemed otherworldly, yet up close, she had been disarmingly human. Her tired smile and trembling hands betraying a burden she carried alone. Across town, Layla sat in a cramped apartment overlooking the cobbled streets of Montmartre. Her modest living space was a world away from the opulence Karim had grown up in. Faded posters of famous ballets adorned the walls, and a single bookshelf overflowed with dog-eared novels and medical journals. On the small kitchen table lay a stack of unopened bills and a letter from her physician, a reminder of the diagnosis that had loomed over her life like a storm cloud. Layla ran her fingers over the letter's edge, her chest tightening. The words were familiar by now, a degenerative condition that would inevitably rob her of the one thing she had dedicated her life to: dance. The pain in her joints had become a daily battle, but she refused to let it show. Her colleagues, and even her closest friends, believed her exhaustion was the natural toll of a grueling profession, and she intended to keep it that way. For Layla, the stage was a sanctuary. It was the only place where she could escape the confines of her reality, where she was not a woman with an incurable condition, but an artist capable of touching hearts. And yet, the weight of her secret grew heavier with each performance. On the other side of Paris, Karim returned to the luxury suite his family maintained for him whenever he visited. The stark contrast between his world and the one Layla likely inhabited struck him deeply. His suite, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and curated art pieces, felt suffocatingly empty. His days were spent navigating the expectations of his family, a dynasty steeped in tradition and wealth, where duty always came before personal desires. Karim's phone buzzed on the marble countertop, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from his mother, Amira Al-Farid, reminded him of their upcoming meeting with a potential business partner. Beneath her formal words lay the unspoken pressure that had governed his life. Since childhood, everything he did was for the legacy of the Al-Farid name. The next morning, Karim attended the charity gala's follow-up luncheon, his presence obligatory. As guests mingled over delicate pastries and fine wine, he overheard whispers about the previous night's performance. Layla's name surfaced repeatedly, her talent praised with reverence. Yet, there were hints of criticism, speculations about her stamina, and whether she could maintain her demanding schedule. "She's talented, no doubt," one patron murmured, "but I've heard whispers that her body might not hold up. Such a shame." Karim felt a surge of indignation. He excused himself from the conversation, his frustration mounting. How easily people spoke of others' struggles without understanding the weight they bore. His thoughts turned to Layla, her poised smile, the tremor in her hands, and he wondered how much of herself she sacrificed for her art. Later that evening, Karim found himself outside a small cafe near Montmartre, the address obtained discreetly through an acquaintance. He hesitated before stepping inside, unsure if he was intruding on her life. The warm, bustling interior contrasted sharply with the crisp evening air. There she was, seated near the window with a notebook in hand, her posture graceful even in repose. Layla noticed him before he could speak. Her expression shifted from surprise to guarded curiosity. "Mr. Al-Farid," she greeted, her tone measured. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Karim offered a small smile. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you again for last night's performance." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she gestured to the seat across from her. "You've already thanked me. Twice, if I recall." He chuckled, sensing her wariness. "I suppose I wanted to understand what drives someone to dedicate their life to something so demanding. Your passion is remarkable." Layla studied him for a moment, her defenses softening slightly. "Dance is not just something I do. It's who I am. It's the language I use to say what words cannot." Her sincerity struck a chord in Karim, and yet it seems to come at a great cost. Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place: pain, perhaps, or defiance. "Everything worth doing comes at a cost, Mr. Al-Farid." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Karim left the cafe with an unshakable feeling that Layla's strength masked a deeper vulnerability. As he walked back through the narrow streets, he realized he was no longer merely intrigued by her talent. He was drawn to the woman behind the performance, the one who carried her burdens with a grace that rivaled her artistry. The autumn air was crisp as Karim stood at the edge of Place des Vosges, staring at the swirling leaves as if they might reveal some hidden wisdom. His mind was preoccupied with Lila Mounet. Their brief conversations had revealed glimpses of her tenacity, but they had also left him with questions he couldn't shake. What was she hiding behind those composed smiles? And why did he care so deeply about a woman he barely knew? Driven by this restlessness, Karim reached out to Layla again, this time inviting her to dinner. To his mild surprise, she accepted, though her tone was cautious. They met at a quiet bistro tucked away in a corner of La Marais, its intimate lighting casting a warm glow over their table. Layla arrived wearing a simple black dress, her hair loosely tied back, exuding an effortless elegance. Karim stood as she approached, greeting her with a mixture of excitement and nervousness he hadn't felt in years. They exchanged pleasantries before easing into conversation, but it wasn't long before Karim broached the subject that had been consuming him. "Layla," he began, his voice soft but earnest. "Forgive me if I'm overstepping, but I've noticed. Something seems to be troubling you." Her fork paused midair, and she regarded him with a guarded expression. "I don't mean to be rude, but that's a rather personal observation for someone I've only recently met." Karim raised his hand slightly in surrender. "You're right, I don't mean to pry. It's just that last night at the cafe you spoke about sacrifice, and it stayed with me. I admire your dedication, but I can't help wondering what it's costing you." Layla set her fork down, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What exactly are you asking, Mr. Alfred?" He hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "I'm asking if there's a way I can help." Her laugh was soft but devoid of humor. "Help? With what? Dancing? Life?" She shook her head. "That's a kind offer, but you don't know me well enough to make it." Karim leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're right, I don't, but I'd like to." For a moment, her defenses faltered, and the exhaustion she usually hid so well flickered across her face. She sighed, as though releasing a weight she had carried for far too long. "You're persistent, aren't you?" "I prefer to think of it as determined," he replied with a faint smile. "But I'll stop if you ask me to." Layla considered him carefully, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. Finally, she spoke. "Since you're so determined, I have a medical condition. It's degenerative, my joints. They're breaking down faster than they should." Karim's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Does this mean—" "It means I won't be able to dance for much longer," she interrupted, her voice steady but tinged with a bitterness she couldn't entirely suppress. "Months, maybe a year if I'm lucky." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Karim struggled to find the right words. "Layla, I'm so sorry. That must be incredibly difficult." She shrugged, her composure returning. "It's life. You don't get to choose the cards you're dealt, only how you play them." He admired her resilience, but felt an overwhelming urge to do something, anything, to ease her burden. "What if there's a way to extend your time on stage? Medical care, therapy, whatever it takes. I can help." Her smile returned, but it was strained. "And why would you do that? Out of pity? Because you think I'm some tragic figure in need of saving?" "No," he said firmly, "because I believe in your talent. And because I want to see you continue doing what you love for as long as possible." Layla studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, but I've spent my entire life proving I can stand on my own 2 feet, literally and figuratively. I'm not about to stop now." Karim wanted to argue, but he sensed that pushing her further would only drive her away. Instead, he nodded, his respect for her growing despite her refusal. "I understand. The offer stands, no strings attached." They spent the rest of the evening discussing lighter topics, but the undercurrent of their earlier conversation lingered. When the check arrived, Karim insisted on paying, despite Layla's protests. As they stepped out into the night, he turned to her. "Layla, I meant what I said. I'm here if you need anything." Her smile softened, and for the first time, it felt genuine. "Thank you, Karim. Good night." As she walked away, her silhouette fading into the lamplight, Karim felt both frustrated and inspired. He didn't know how, but he was determined to find a way to help her. For the first time in years, he had found someone worth fighting for. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Alfred suite in Paris, casting long golden shadows across the polished marble floor. Karim sat at the dining table, his phone buzzing incessantly with messages from his mother, Amira. She had an uncanny way of keeping tabs on him, even from thousands of miles away in Abu Dhabi. "Karim." Her voice came through on the call. He finally answered, steady but tinged with expectation. "I trust your time in Paris is productive?" "It is," he replied, though his thoughts were far from the business meeting she likely imagined. Good, Amira continued. I've arranged a dinner with the Khalib family next week. Their daughter, Yasmin, has just returned from her studies in London. It's time you considered your responsibilities, Karim. Responsibilities. The word hit him like a dull blow. It was always there, hovering in the background of every decision he made, a reminder of the life meticulously planned for him. I'll think about it, he said, his tone measured. You won't just think about it, Amira snapped, her patience thinning. You'll attend. This is about the family, about the future. As the call ended, Karim leaned back in his chair, the weight of his mother's expectations pressing down on him. For years, he had played the dutiful son, adhering to tradition and fulfilling the role of heir without complaint. But now, for the first time, he felt a pull in another direction, one that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed life his family had envisioned. Meanwhile, on the other side of Paris, Layla stood in the center of the studio, surrounded by her fellow dancers. The rehearsal for their upcoming performance was in full swing, the music echoing through the space as their choreographer barked corrections. Layla pushed herself harder than ever, determined to keep up despite the searing pain in her knees. Each movement felt like a battle, her body betraying her in ways it never had before. She knew the whispers had already started, the subtle glances and murmurs among the corps de ballet. She's slowing down, one dancer had said the day before, her voice just loud enough for Layla to hear. I don't know how much longer she lasts. Layla clenched her jaw, refusing to let their words shake her. She had earned her place here through sheer grit and talent, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away. But as the rehearsal stretched on, the weight of their judgment became harder to ignore. Afterward, she retreated to the quiet of a nearby park, her breath fogging in the cool afternoon air. She sat on a bench, massaging her aching knees and staring out at the falling leaves. The pain was getting worse, and deep down, she knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. But what choice did she have? Dance was all she had ever known. As she sat lost in thought, her phone buzzed with a message from Karim. Are you free this evening? I'd like to see you. She hesitated, then typed back a quick reply. I can meet at 7. That evening, they met at a small, dimly lit cafe, a world away from the glittering venues Karim was accustomed to. He noticed the fatigue in her eyes immediately, but refrained from mentioning it, knowing she would brush it off. Instead, he focused on their conversation, steering it toward the lighter topics until, inevitably, the subject of her condition surfaced. Layla, he said carefully, have you considered taking some time off? To rest? Maybe explore other options? She smiled wryly. Rest? And do what? Dancing is all I've ever done. It's who I am, but it doesn't have to define you. Karim pressed gently. You're more than just a dancer. Layla's expression hardened. You don't understand. Dance isn't just something I do. It's my identity. Without it, I don't know who I am. Karim fell silent, sensing the depth of her struggle. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she deserved more than a life of pain and sacrifice, but he knew it wasn't his place. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers briefly. I'm not trying to change who you are. I just want you to know you don't have to face this alone. For a moment, her guard slipped, and she looked at him with something close to gratitude. Thank you, Karim. That means more than you know. As they parted ways, Karim's resolve hardened. He couldn't force Layla to accept his help, but he could find another way to support her, even if it meant challenging the expectations of everyone around him. The rain tapped gently against the tall windows of the rehearsal studio, blending with the strains of a solo violin playing over the speakers. Layla stood in the center of the room, poised on the edge of a pirouette. Her movements, while graceful to the untrained eye, were slower than she wanted them to be. The pain in her knees had grown sharper, biting at her confidence. The music ended, and the studio fell silent except for her labored breathing. Layla sank onto a bench, pressing her palms into her thighs, as if willing her body to obey her once more. I'll be damned if I let this stop me, she muttered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city outside. Unbeknownst to her, Karim stood quietly by the doorway, He had arrived unannounced, hesitant to disturb her rehearsal, but unable to resist the pull of seeing her in her element. For all her fatigue, she still radiated a kind of beauty the words failed to capture. "Impressive as always," he said finally, stepping into the room. Layla started, turning to see him. "Kareem? What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you," he said, his tone light but tinged with concern. "I hope you don't mind," she sighed, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. "I don't have the energy to mind today." He moved closer, his gaze soft. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Layla met his eyes, her defenses slipping slightly. "And what's the alternative? Giving up?" Kareem sat beside her on the bench, the wood creaking softly under his weight. "Not giving up, just finding a way to work smarter, not harder." She raised an eyebrow. "Smarter?" He hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking. What if we organized a performance? Something that highlights your talent and raises awareness for others who may be facing similar challenges?" Layla blinked, caught off guard. "A performance? Kareem, I can barely make it through rehearsals these days. How do you expect me to perform?" "You're more than capable," he said firmly. "And this isn't just about you. It's about showing the world what resilience looks like. It's about leaving a legacy, Layla." The word hung in the air, and for the first time, she didn't dismiss it outright. "A legacy," she repeated, her voice quiet. Kareem leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I'll handle everything. The venue, the promotion, even the funding if necessary. All you have to do is show the world what you've shown me, that you're unstoppable." Her instinct was to argue, to remind him of her limits, but something in his tone stopped her. There was no pity in his words, no condescension, only belief, something she hadn't felt in herself for a long time. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a lot to ask." "I'm not asking," Kareem said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm offering, and if it doesn't work out, at least you'll know you tried. That's all that matters." Layla stared at him, her mind racing. The idea scared her, putting herself on stage in a way she never had before. But it also stirred something else deep within her, hope. "Let me think about it," she said at last, her voice soft. "Take all the time you need," Kareem replied, standing. "Just know that I believe in you, no matter what you decide." As he left the studio, Layla watched him go, her heart heavy, but her mind alight with possibilities. She had spent so long fighting to stay afloat, she had forgotten what it felt like to dream. Over the next few days, the idea began to take shape. Kareem reached out to contacts in the arts community, securing a small but prestigious theater in the heart of Paris. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating details and ensuring that the event would be nothing short of extraordinary. Layla, meanwhile, wrestled with her own doubts. Each rehearsal was a battle, her body pushing back against every movement she demanded of it. But she couldn't ignore the spark that Kareem had ignited. For the first time in months, she felt as though she was working towards something greater than herself. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, she sat alone in the studio, staring at her reflection in the mirrored wall. Her mind replayed Kareem's words. It's about leaving a legacy. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. "Kareem," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I'll do it. Let's make this performance happen." The theater buzzed with activity as workers adjusted lighting rigs and set pieces for the upcoming performance. Kareem stood in the center of it all, his phone in one hand and a clipboard in the other, coordinating with event staff. Despite the chaos, his focus remained sharp. He had poured himself into this project, not just for Layla, but because he believed in the message it carried. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. "You're making a spectacle out of yourself," Amira's voice cut sharply through the phone. "Do you think this is what the Al-Farid name stands for? Some frivolous art performance in Paris?" Kareem took a deep breath, keeping his tone calm. "It's not frivolous, Mother. It's important. This performance is about resilience, about showing people they can overcome the odds." Amira scoffed. "And who is this woman you're so desperate to impress?" "Don't think I haven't heard the whispers." "This isn't about impressing anyone," Kareem replied, his patience wearing thin. "It's about doing something meaningful, something that matters." "What matters," Amira said coldly, "is your duty to this family. Remember who you are, Kareem. Don't let this distraction ruin everything we've built." The line went dead, leaving Kareem staring at his phone, frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. For years, he had lived in the shadow of his family's expectations, never questioning the path laid out for him. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of his own convictions pushing back. Meanwhile, Layla sat alone in the rehearsal studio, staring at the piano as it played the opening bars of her solo piece. Her knees throbbed, the pain a constant reminder of her body's limitations. She had agreed to the performance, but as the date approached, doubts crept in like shadows, threatening to overwhelm her. What if she couldn't do it? What if she collapsed on stage, her body betraying her in front of an audience? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The door opened and Kareem stepped inside, his presence a welcome distraction from her spiraling thoughts. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice warm despite the tension lingering from his earlier conversation. Layla forced a smile. "Well enough, at least for now." Kareem walked over and sat beside her on the floor, his suit jacket a stark contrast against the warm wooden boards. "You're worried," he said gently. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't," she admitted. "Every time I rehearse, I wonder if it'll be the last time I can make it through a full piece." "You'll make it," Kareem said firmly. "I know you will." Layla glanced at him, her expression softening. "You always seem so sure of everything. How do you do that?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not as sure as I seem, but I've learned that doubt doesn't get you anywhere. Belief, whether in yourself or someone else, is what makes the difference." His words settled over her like a balm, easing the tension in her shoulders. For all her fears, there was something undeniably comforting about Kareem's steadfast faith in her. But the challenges were far from over. Over the next week, rehearsals became increasingly grueling as Layla pushed herself harder than ever. The strain on her body was evident, her movements growing slower, her breaths more labored. Kareem watched from the sidelines, his concern mounting. One evening, after an especially taxing session, Layla collapsed into a chair, her face pale and slick with sweat. Kareem rushed to her side, kneeling in front of her. "You're overdoing it," he said, his voice laced with worry. "You need to rest." "I can't rest," she snapped, though the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her. "The performance is in less than a week. If I don't push through now, I'll never be ready." "You won't be ready if you injure yourself," Kareem countered. Layla looked away, her jaw tight. "You don't understand. If I don't give this everything I have, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. And if you destroy yourself in the process?" Kareem asked, his tone softening. "What then?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Layla closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just know I can't stop." Kareem reached for her hand, his touch gentle but grounding. "You don't have to do this alone, Layla. I'm here. Whatever happens, I'm here." Her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time, she let herself lean into his support. In that moment, the wall she had carefully constructed began to crumble, replaced by something fragile but infinitely more real. As the night deepened, they sat together in silence, the weight of their shared fears and hopes binding them closer than ever. Despite the storm of challenges swirling around them, one thing was clear: they would face it together. The theater was quiet that morning, sunlight filtering through the high windows and casting long shadows over the stage. Layla stood at the edge of the platform, gazing out at the empty rows of seats. This was where it would all come together or fall apart. The enormity of what lay ahead pressed down on her chest like an anchor. Kareem appeared behind her, his footsteps light but purposeful. He carried 2 cups of coffee, the faint aroma breaking the stillness. "I thought you could use this," he said, handing her one. Layla accepted it with a small smile. Thanks. For a moment, they stood side by side, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been in weeks. Finally, Kareem broke it. How are you feeling? Terrified, she admitted, taking a sip of her coffee, but also oddly excited. It's a strange combination. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the stage. That's how you know it matters. Layla glanced at him, her smile softening. You always seem to have the right thing to say. Not always, he replied with a chuckle, but I try. The past week had been a blur of rehearsals and preparations, each day bringing its own set of challenges. Layla's body continued to push back against her demands, the pain in her knees growing sharper with every session. But Kareem had been there, steadfast and unwavering, reminding her that she wasn't in this alone. The turning point came during a visit to her doctor, Dr. Lemoyne. Kareem had insisted on accompanying her, despite her initial protests. As they sat in the sterile office, the doctor reviewed her latest scans with a furrowed brow. The damage has progressed, he said, his tone clinical but not unkind. But there's still time to manage the symptoms. With the right precautions, I believe you can make it through the performance. Layla exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. And after that, Doctor? Lemoyne hesitated before replying. We'll reassess. But for now, focus on what's in front of you, one step at a time. Kareem placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they left the office, his expression calm but resolute. One step at a time, he echoed. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it might be possible. Back at the theater, preparations for the benefit performance were in full swing. Kareem had thrown himself into the logistics, ensuring every detail was accounted for, from the lighting to the guest list. His dedication left Layla in awe. He wasn't just supporting her, he was building a foundation beneath her dreams. But it wasn't just the physical work that mattered. Kareem had a way of easing her fears without diminishing them, acknowledging her struggles while reminding her of her strength. He encouraged her to take breaks when she needed them, to rest when her body demanded it. And slowly but surely, she began to listen. One evening, after a particularly successful rehearsal, Kareem surprised her with a small celebration. He had arranged for the theater staff to bring in candles and a bottle of champagne, transforming the stage into a space of quiet joy. What's all this? Layla asked, laughing as she stepped onto the stage. A reminder, Kareem said, pouring 2 glasses of champagne, that even in the middle of chaos, there's room for moments like this. Layla accepted the glass he handed her, her laughter fading into a soft smile. You're something else. You know that? Just trying to keep up with you, he replied, his eyes warm. They clinked their glasses, the sound echoing softly in the empty theater. For a while, they simply sat together, the pressure of the performance momentarily forgotten. The next day brought renewed determination. Layla threw herself into the final rehearsals, her movements more precise and deliberate than ever. The pain was still there, gnawing at her resolve, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Kareem's faith in her had become a beacon, guiding her through the darkness. As the day of the performance approached, Layla found herself reflecting on how far she had come, not just in her career, but in her understanding of herself. She had always believed strength meant carrying her burdens alone. But Kareem had shown her a different kind of strength, the courage to lean on someone else. The night before the performance, Kareem found her sitting in the wings, staring out at the empty stage. Couldn't sleep? He asked, sitting beside her. She shook her head. Too many thoughts. Want to share them? Layla hesitated before replying. I'm scared. What if I fail? What if this doesn't live up to everything we've worked for? Kareem placed a hand over hers, his touch steady. You won't fail, Layla. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already succeeded. You've shown everyone what it means to fight, to persevere. That's more than enough. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For believing in me. Kareem smiled, his hand still resting over hers. Always. As they sat together in the quiet of the theater, The weight of their journey settled around them, not as a burden, but as a testament to the light they had found in each other. The day of the performance arrived, bringing with it a frenetic energy that rippled through the theater. The once empty stage was now alive with movement as technicians fine-tuned the lighting. Musicians rehearsed their cues, and ushers prepared for the arrival of the audience. Layla sat in her dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled into an elegant bun, but her eyes betrayed the storm brewing within her. The months of preparation had culminated in this moment, and the weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. Her knees throbbed, a reminder of her condition that no amount of adrenaline could silence. The thought of stepping onto the stage and pushing through the pain filled her with equal parts determination and dread. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Karim stepped into the room, his presence grounding as always. He carried a small bouquet of white roses, their petals delicate and pristine. "For you," he said, handing her the flowers. Lila smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you. They're beautiful. How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Nervous," she admitted, "but ready." Karim nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've worked for this moment, Layla. Trust yourself." She placed the roses on the table beside her, her gaze returning to the mirror. "It's not just about me anymore. This performance, it's bigger than that. And that's exactly why you'll succeed," Karim said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Their moment was interrupted by a knock from the stage manager, signaling that it was time. Layla stood, smoothing the fabric of her costume. Karim offered his hand, and she took it, drawing strength from his steady grip. The theater was packed, the hum of the audience audible even from backstage. Layla peeked through the curtain, her breath hitching at the sight of the crowd. Among them were journalists, prominent figures from the arts community, and even a few familiar faces from her company. "This is it," she murmured to herself. The opening notes of the orchestra swelled, filling the theater with a hauntingly beautiful melody. Layla stepped onto the stage, her movements slow and deliberate as she positioned herself in the center. The lights dimmed, and for a moment, the world fell away, leaving only the stage and the music. She began to dance. Every movement was a testament to her journey, each step imbued with a mix of pain and passion. The audience watched in rapt silence, their eyes fixed on the lone figure who commanded the stage. But halfway through the performance, Layla felt a sharp pang in her knee. Her balance faltered for a fraction of a second, barely perceptible to the audience, but glaringly obvious to her. She clenched her jaw, pushing through the pain as the music built toward its crescendo. From the wings, Karim watched with bated breath, his hands clenched into fists. He could see the strain on her face, the subtle stiffness in her movements. But she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The final sequence approached, a series of demanding leaps and turns that required every ounce of her strength. Layla hesitated for the briefest of moments before launching into the routine. The pain was excruciating, but she channeled it into her performance, her movements transcending the physical limitations of her body. As the last note of the orchestra faded, Layla collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as the lights dimmed. The theater erupted into applause, the sound thunderous and unrelenting. Karim rushed to her side, helping her to her feet as the curtain fell. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Layla leaned into him, her strength spent but her heart full. "I did it," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," Karim said, holding her tightly. "You did." Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Members of the crew and fellow dancers congratulated her, their words a blur as she focused on the man beside her. For all the applause and accolades, it was Karim's unwavering support that had carried her through. Later that evening, as the theater emptied and the adrenaline faded, Layla sat alone with Karim in the quiet of the dressing room. Her body ached, the reality of her condition settling over her once more. but for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kareem smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Now we take it one step at a time, together." Layla nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Whatever the future held, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The applause roared through the theater like a tidal wave, rolling over Layla as she stood at the center of the stage, her chest heaving and knees trembling. The spotlight bathed her in warm light, masking the pain that coursed through her body. For a moment, she couldn't move, frozen by the intensity of the audience's reaction. Then she bowed. The sound grew even louder, a cacophony of cheers and whistles that left her breathless. Tears welled in her eyes, not from the pain but from the overwhelming realization that she had done it. She had poured everything she had into this performance, leaving nothing behind. From the wings, Kareem watched, his heart swelling with pride. He had seen every struggle, every moment of doubt, and now he saw her standing victorious before an audience that understood, if only partially, the magnitude of what she had achieved. As the curtain fell, Layla stumbled slightly, her legs barely holding her weight. Kareem was by her side in an instant, his arms steadying her. "Layla," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you were extraordinary." She managed a tired smile, leaning into him as he guided her offstage. "I couldn't have done it without you." Backstage, the atmosphere was jubilant. Members of the crew, the orchestra, and even a few dancers from Layla's company surrounded her, offering congratulations and flowers. The weight of their words felt surreal, as though she were floating outside her own body. Among the crowd, Dr. Pierre Lemoyne approached, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You were brilliant," he said, his eyes scanning her carefully, "but I need to check on you." Kareem led Layla to a quiet corner where Dr. Lemoyne knelt before her, examining her knees. She winced as he pressed gently along the inflamed joints, his brow furrowing. "You've pushed yourself to the limit," he said gravely, "more than I would have advised." "I had to," Layla replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. "There was no other choice, Doctor." Lemoyne sighed, standing. "You'll need to rest now. No dancing, no rehearsals. Your body needs time to recover, if it can." The words hung heavy in the air, but Layla nodded. She had made peace with this moment long before stepping onto the stage. Later that night, as the theater emptied and the chaos faded, Kareem found her sitting alone in the dressing room, still in her costume. Her hair had fallen loose from its bun, framing her face in soft curls. He stepped inside quietly, carrying a steaming cup of tea. "You should change," he said, placing the cup on the table in front of her. Layla shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not yet. I want to remember this feeling a little longer." Kareem sat beside her, his eyes searching hers. "What are you thinking?" She exhaled deeply, her gaze distant. That it was worth it, every bit of it. The pain, the doubt, the fear. "Tonight I felt alive in a way I haven't in years." He reached for her hand, his touch grounding. "You've inspired so many people tonight, Layla, myself included." Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude and something deeper. "I couldn't have done this without you, Kareem. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That means more than you'll ever know." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the evening settling around them. For all the triumph, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of what lay ahead, the recovery, the uncertainty, the challenges that would come next. But in that moment, none of it mattered. "Do you regret it?" Kareem asked softly. Layla shook her head. "Not for a second." He smiled, his hand tightening around hers. "Good, because neither do I." As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, they remained together in the quiet of the dressing room, their shared triumph a beacon against the unknown. The aftermath of the performance felt like a dream until it didn't. Layla awoke the next morning to a sharp, relentless pain in her knees. She tried to sit up, but her body protested, her muscles refusing to cooperate after the strain of the previous night. For the first time in months, The determination that had carried her through seemed to falter. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her hand trembling slightly. A flurry of messages awaited her: congratulations, praise, invitations to interviews. But they felt distant, like echoes in a vast canyon. The triumph of the night before was now overshadowed by the reality she had tried to ignore. Her body had reached its breaking point. A knock at the door broke through her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice hoarse. Karim entered, carrying a tray with coffee and a plate of fruit. His face, though calm, betrayed a trace of worry. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by a truck," Layla replied, managing a weak smile. Karim set the tray on the bedside table and sat beside her. "You pushed yourself too hard." "I had to," she said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "You know that." He nodded, his hand brushing hers gently. "I do. But now, it's time to rest." For a moment, Layla allowed herself to lean into his support, closing her eyes as his steady presence calmed the storm raging within her. But even as she found solace in his touch, a new fear began to take root. What came next? Could she face a life without dance? Across the city, Karim faced battles of his own. The tension in the Al-Farid family estate in Paris was palpable as he entered the sprawling drawing room, where his mother waited. Amira sat on a velvet chaise, her posture as rigid as her expression. "Karim," she began, her tone clipped. "I've received word of your little project." Karim took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. It wasn't a project. It was a performance of benefit for an important cause. "A cause?" Amira's voice dripped with disdain. "You're an Al-Farid. Your duty is to the family, to the legacy we've built, not to some fleeting whim." "This wasn't a whim," Karim shot back, his voice steady but firm. "It was about making a difference, about supporting someone who deserves to be seen." Amira rose to her feet, her presence commanding. "And who, exactly, is this someone? A dancer? An outsider? Have you forgotten your place, Karim?" "No," he said, his voice cold now. "But perhaps you have forgotten that I'm not just a pawn in the family's game. I have a life of my own, and I won't apologize for using it to help someone I care about." The room fell silent, Amira's sharp gaze locking with his. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and laced with warning. "If you continue down this path, Karim, there will be consequences, for you and for her." Karim stared at her, a mixture of anger and sadness in his eyes. "If that's the price of doing what's right, then so be it." He turned on his heel and left the room, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. Back at Layla's apartment, the shadows of the day deepened. Karim returned to find her sitting on the couch, her legs propped up on pillows and her eyes fixed on the television. Though it was clear, her mind was elsewhere. "Long day?" she asked as he entered, her tone light but forced. He nodded, sitting beside her. "Eventful. How about you?" Layla hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a blanket. "Karim, what if this was it? What if last night was the last time I'll ever dance?" He turned to her, his expression softening. "It doesn't have to be. But what if it is?" She pressed, her voice cracking. "What if everything I've worked for, everything I've dreamed of, ends here?" Karim reached for her hands, holding them tightly. "Then we'll find a new dream, Layla, together." Tears streamed down her face as she leaned into him, the weight of her fears spilling over. For all her strength, she couldn't hide from the truth any longer. Her body might never allow her to dance again. In the quiet of the evening, they sat together, their shared struggles binding them closer than ever. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges neither of them could fully anticipate. But for the first time, they faced it as a united front, determined to find light even in the darkest hour. The days following the performance passed in a blur. Layla's apartment became her sanctuary as she allowed herself the time her body so desperately needed to heal. Karim visited daily, bringing meals, books, and quiet encouragement that never felt overbearing. His presence was a constant reminder that she didn't have to face this alone. The accolades from the performance continued to pour in. Articles appeared in prominent arts magazines, praising her artistry and courage. Invitations to interviews and opportunities for collaboration flooded her inbox, though she couldn't help but wonder if they were for her talent or the narrative of her triumph against the odds. "You've become quite the star," Karim remarked one evening, scrolling through an article on his tablet as they sat on her couch. Layla rolled her eyes, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Don't remind me. It feels strange, like they're talking about someone else." "They're talking about you," he said firmly, setting the tablet aside. "Because you've inspired people. You should be proud of that." She glanced at him, the sincerity in his eyes making her chest tighten. "It's hard to feel proud when I don't know what comes next." Karim leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Then let's figure it out. Together." Layla hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. The fear of the unknown still lingered, but Karim's unwavering belief in her had begun to chip away at her doubts. The turning point came a week later during a follow-up appointment with Dr. Lemoyne. He reviewed her progress with a critical eye, his tone pragmatic but encouraging. "The inflammation is subsiding," he said, setting her chart aside, "but the underlying damage remains. You'll need to be careful. Pushing yourself too hard could cause irreparable harm." Layla nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the examination table. "Does this mean I'll never dance again?" Dr. Lemoyne hesitated. "It means your days of grueling performances and rehearsals are likely over. But there are other ways to keep dance in your life, ways that don't involve jeopardizing your health." The words struck her with unexpected clarity. For so long, she had equated her identity with the physical act of dancing, but perhaps it didn't have to end there. That evening, she shared the news with Karim as they strolled along the Seine. The crisp air carried the faint scent of autumn, and the city's lights shimmered on the water's surface. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice tentative. "If I can't perform, maybe I can teach or choreograph. There's so much I've learned over the years. I could pass that on to others." Karim's face lit up with a smile. "That's a brilliant idea. You'd be incredible at it." Her cheeks flushed at his enthusiasm. "It's just an idea for now, but it feels right. And whatever you decide, I'm with you," he said, his hand brushing hers. In the weeks that followed, Layla began exploring her new path. She reached out to contacts in the dance community, offering to mentor young dancers and collaborate on small projects. To her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. One day, Karim surprised her with an idea of his own. "What if we started a program together?" he suggested over coffee at her kitchen table, a space for kids who might not otherwise have access to the arts. "You could teach dance, and we could bring in other instructors. Music, theater, visual arts. It could be a place for creativity and growth." Layla stared at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You do that? For me?" "For us," he corrected, his smile warm. "And for everyone who deserves a chance to dream big." Tears filled her eyes as she reached across the table to take his hand. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, Karim Al-Farid." He squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't have to do anything. You're enough, just as you are." Together, they began laying the groundwork for their project, pooling their talents and resources to create something meaningful. The challenges were many: securing funding, finding the right location, building a network of instructors, but each step felt purposeful, a testament to their shared vision. Through it all, their bond deepened. Karim's steadfast support and Layla's newfound resilience became the foundation of their partnership. Both professionally and personally, they weren't just building a program, they were building a life together. As the first students arrived at their modest studio months later, Layla watched with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. The joy on the children's faces as they explored the space reminded her of why she had fallen in love with dance in the first place. Karim stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Look at what you've created," he said softly. Layla turned to him, her smile radiant. "What we've created." In that moment, she realized that her journey wasn't about losing her identity as a dancer. It was about discovering who she could become beyond it. And with Karim by her side, the possibilities felt endless. The studio buzzed with energy as children filled the space, their laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the hardwood floors where eager students stretched and twirled under Layla's guidance. She moved among them with a grace that transcended her physical limitations, her sharp eyes catching every detail. "Point your toes, Sophie," she said gently, kneeling beside a young girl who was attempting a ply. "That's it, beautiful." From the doorway, Kareem watched with quiet admiration. His heart swelled at the sight of Layla in her element, her passion shining brighter than ever. She had come so far, transforming her struggles into something that brought joy and opportunity to others. It was a testament to her resilience, and he couldn't have been prouder. The program they had built together had grown faster than either of them had anticipated. What had started as a modest dream had blossomed into a thriving community, attracting children from all walks of life. With Karim's business acumen and Layla's artistry, they had created a haven where young people could discover and nurture their talents. Later that afternoon, as the last students filed out of the studio, Layla and Karim sat together on the floor, leaning against the mirrored wall. The space was quiet now, the hum of activity replaced by a peaceful stillness. "I still can't believe this is real," Layla said, her voice tinged with awe. "Every time I see their faces, it feels like a dream." Karim reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "It's real because you made it real. You turned something painful into something beautiful." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you. We did this together," he said, his voice steady. "And this is just the beginning." Layla's thoughts drifted back to the journey that had brought them here, the struggles, the sacrifices, the triumphs. She had once believed that losing the ability to perform would mean losing a part of herself. But now she understood that her identity wasn't tied to any single moment or achievement. It was ever evolving, shaped by the people she loved and the impact she chose to make. "Do you think we'll ever stop?" she asked softly. "Dreaming, building, creating?" Kareem chuckled, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Not a chance. There's too much left to do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the golden light fade into twilight. Outside the studio, the world moved on, but within these walls, they had created something timeless, a testament to hope, resilience, and the power of love. As the evening deepened, Kareem stood and extended his hand to her. "Come on, let's go home." Layla took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. "Home," she repeated, the word filling her with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Together, they walked out into the cool night air, their steps in sync as they headed toward a future that felt as boundless as the stars above. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they would face them side by side, partners in life, in love, and in the unending journey of creation.